Okay, I believe you're good.
All right. Good afternoon, folks. It's Daryl from Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center, and today we're going to talk about revivalism, and I think this is an important topic because in a lot of ways it helps us set up some of our understandings of the politics and the social reform movements that created the climate that led to the American Civil War. So when we think about revivalism, I think most of us have some sense of what the word means. But it's very helpful, I think, to take a longer historical view of this and think about how revival culture and how revival religion, which is part of this democratic expression of religion that we were looking at last time, how that developed very specifically and how it led to very different paths for northern and southern evangelicals, because the interpretations, the versions, the readings of both scripture and of theology and the ways that people imagined conversion intertwined in some cases and diverged very distinctively in others. So what we're going to do today is talk about what I see as two periods of revival activity in the United States in the early 19th century that really set the table for the 1850s and the 1860s. So, but the thing that I think is important to start with, and some of this is just I'm going to go through some fairly technical aspects and some fairly long descriptions of some processes that are in play here, because the process of conversion is what's at the core of revival culture, and it's a significant change. The revivals of the 18th century and the revivals of at the turn of the 19th century and then later in the 1830s, 1820s, and 1830s are very distinctive. They're distinctive in their form, they're distinctive in their theology, and they're distinctive in the social energy that comes out of these revival movements. And I don't want to put too much emphasis on the social side of things, because these are, as Dixon Bruce put it very, very carefully in his book, They All Sang Hallelujah, this is at the core a religious experience, a religious movement, and the social aspects that come around it certainly are important, but to really understand what people thought they were doing at the time and how they were responding to the world around them requires that we think about this interior life, the way that these people are picturing their relationship to God, how they're seeking salvation, and how they're understanding the process of salvation. So let's talk a little bit first about conversion, because the notion of conversion changes distinctively during the late 18th and early 19th century. And it really moves from a system or an understanding of how God works amongst humans and within the world in fundamental ways. It's a shift from a theocentric form of conversion that you would have seen in Calvinism, in a very strict Calvinism. This is where God has all control over the conversion process. In fact, some of the more extreme Calvinists in the 18th century would have argued that you really never would know that you were converted and that you had been chosen, because God, the concept of the limited atonement that was a central part of Calvinism, held that one did not affect conversion. God affected conversion. God sent Christ to die only for the elect, and that human agency had little or nothing to do with the process. God chose you. You may or may not know that you were converted, but you had to live a pious, holy life to gain some potential insight into your converted state. But really, you never know if you were one of the elect. So all of the process of conversion is in God's hands in a strictly Calvinist system, and that's the dominant theological position of the churches, particularly the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians in the 18th century. And as we talked last time, there's a significant change in the denominational patterns in the United States in the first part of the 19th century, and really at the core of this is this changing notion of how God works amongst men, and how men and women can take it upon themselves to seek conversion, to seek holiness, to act in a holy way, to make oneself more like Christ, more like God, and seek perfection, as they would have put it in the early part of the 19th century. Charles Gradison Finney, and we're going to talk a lot about Finney today. He's a central figure in the revival culture of the 19th century. And we're primarily going to be looking at the Northeast, especially New York and the Burned Over District, where Finney had his greatest and earliest successes as a revivalist, and then think about the kinds of energy that come out of the revivals themselves, and this changed sense of how one could become converted. And Finney put it this way, and this I think very nicely reflects the shift in the way that people are understanding conversion. He said, "Religion is the work of man. It is something for man to do. There's a performative side to this. There's an active side to this. There is a positive human contribution that could be made to the conversion experience." And Finney was a master at prompting conversions, at encouraging people. But we'll get to that just in a couple of minutes. But I want us to think for just a couple of minutes, not very long, but just a minute, to remind ourselves where we have come from and where we are going by the middle part of the 19th century. And if we can back up just a half a step and think about these Calvinists, Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, both very successful revival preachers in the 19th century, were still Calvinists. And they didn't expect the kind of searing, instant, very performative, very public expressions of conversion that you will see with Finney and others like him in the 19th century. This is an important shift. But when you're looking at people like Whitefield and Edwards, and I want to read here, they stressed the sinfulness of human nature, their utter incapacity without the direct action of God's grace working. Without the direct action of God's grace working, could salvation come? And salvation, but most importantly, salvation is in God's hands, and something, as one historian has put it, something he dispensed as he saw fit for his own reasons, not human reasons, but the reasons of God that are inscrutable. 19th century evangelicals, as we began to see last time, are moving away. Edwards and Whitefield both are highly educated theologians, very sophisticated in their approaches. And as we move in, of course, we learned last time, as we move into the 19th century, you begin to see a breakdown of those of respect for authoritative figures, respect for orthodox theology, and that the real action of religious organization in the post-establishment world that's created by the Constitution. You're looking at the popularization of Christianity, and religion begins to reflect much more ordinary, common folks' interests and the ways that they're looking at the world. Finney, as I've already mentioned, Finney is one of the most important, probably the most important revivalist preachers in the 19th century. But others you'll recognize names: Lyman Beecher and Francis Asbury, a significant figure in early Methodist history in the United States. They are some of the leading characters in making this transition from a Calvinist view to an Arminian view, a view where God is wholly the primary agent in conversion, to an Arminian theology in which humans can take direct action to seek salvation, and also to perform holiness. They understand, and they continue this notion of original sin, the imputation of sin that comes from Adam and Eve is still a part of what people like Finney and Beecher and Asbury are preaching and thinking about and teaching. But they see sin as a human action. They see sin as something that humans can work to overcome. They're moral. They can act as moral agents in the world. And most importantly for these folks, humans could turn away from sin and embrace moral action. Now, this is what I'm wanting to set up today is a discussion next time about social reforms. But this in this idea that humans can embrace moral action, that they can work to change the world, that they can perfect the world, and in fact, the millennial ideals that developed or ideas that develop in the middle part of the 19th century focus on preparing the way for Christ's return, and then he would once the world was perfected. Once humans lived without sin, Christ could return and reign for 1,000 years. And a lot of this moral reformism that you see in the mid-19th century comes out of this idea or desire to bring on the millennium. And you see a tremendous amount of preaching that focuses on this. Beecher and others are very strong proponents of this millennial view, and they see these agencies, these institutions, these organizations they put together to create moral reform as being the harbingers of Christ's return. So it's a very complicated religious and political and social and moral universe that's being created, and it's a distinctive one. It's one that's very different. The idea that people can change society drives a tremendous amount of politics, a tremendous amount of activity, political and otherwise, in the mid-19th century. So this idea that man can turn away from his sinful nature and then he can embrace moral action is central to the whole notion of the benevolent institutions that are created in the middle part of the 19th century. And I've mentioned Arminianism once before, but I want to come back to it just for a second, because Calvinism does continue to have a tremendous influence in American religious history, particularly in the South, amongst especially the Baptists who become the Southern Baptist Convention in the 1840s. The Reformed Calvinist theology continues to be very important, but in most cases, people who are ministers who are still and teachers who are still thinking about Calvinism and using Calvinism as a theological system, they begin to back off a little bit on this notion of the absolute sovereignty of God in the conversion process, especially. And Arminianism, as I pointed out, has to do with human agency, human activity, in achieving conversion. And in fact, in the Arminian, Jacobus Arminius, the namesake of this form of theology, emphasized the duty and ability to repent and desist from sin. It means that people can do things, because in a strictly Calvinist system, you couldn't resist. You couldn't resist sin. Your nature was sinful, and this is this Arminian emphasis on the ability to repent and to turn from sin is a very significant change in the ways that people are thinking about their relationships to God. So let's go through conversion, because at the center of the revival experience and at the center of all of 19th century evangelicalism is this sense of conversion. Today we'd probably recognize it in the form of being born again, where a very immediate conversion experience leads one into a new relationship to God and to Christ. I think I've lost things here. I'm not sure I am still with you. Okay. My screen just went out. That was a little bit unnerving there for a second. In any case, so conversion becomes the primary function of evangelical religion. It becomes the almost single-minded focus of most preachers and most denominations in the first half of the 19th century. And there are a set of I'm not going to call them rules, but there's a process that becomes fairly standard in establishing conversion, because in the Calvinist system it was a very slow-moving dawning of a sense of conversion, of being one of the elect. It was very quiet. There was, and again, there was never, in a strictly Calvinist sense, there was never full satisfaction in an individual's mind that they were amongst the elect, or those who had been chosen by God to be converted. So the first thing we go back, and it's a fundamental concept in Christianity, that human nature is sinful, and that was imputed to humans after Adam and Eve, and that all humanity bore that mark of sinfulness and that need to be reconciled to God. In the Christian system, it becomes the sacrifice of Christ on the cross that becomes the mediating agents, or he puts Christ as a mediating agent between a sinful man and a holy God. So that still remains. A part of this Arminian system. The omnipotence of God, that he has incredible power, but he also has incredible mercy. And then he can extend that mercy. And again, in this system, you're going to be able to ask for mercy. You're going to ask for forgiveness of their sins and entry into the kingdom. The salvation is held out as a promise for all fallen humans. That Christ's death on the cross was an atonement for human sin. It was a sacrifice. It was that act of mediation that had to be made, that bridge between humanity and God. Now, this is an important part of this 19th century conversion experience, because it was an experience. It wasn't just an idea. Something actually happens, and you see this very dramatically in the revivals that we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. But there's something that happened to people in their faith that was real. It was emotional, and the emotional side of things is a very, very dramatic departure from the Calvinist system, which was a very calculating is maybe not the best word, but that's probably the best word that I think of right now, where there's a lot of introspection, there's a lot of silent thinking and wondering and prayer, whereas in the revivals you have extraordinary expressions of grief, of release and relief, and communitas, as one historian puts it, where the congregation comes together. The Methodists were oftentimes known as shouting Methodists because their services were not staid. They were very raucous. In the camp meetings, especially in the early part of the 19th century, you have tremendous emotional outpourings, and this goes through even the Civil War period and beyond. So what happens during this conversion experience is that there is on the other side of it, there is a sense of a new self, of this notion of being born again, and a new identity and a new community to which you were responsible. Because these evangelical denominations, while they didn't have official church courts, they did enact church discipline. And the congregations would judge the members of a congregation for their sins, for personal sins, for corporate sins. There was in the first half of the 19th century a very robust system of policing within the class system in the Methodist Church. There was a tremendously personal experience, small groups of individuals seeking out holiness, but they're also seeking out that remaining sinfulness within individuals. So there was a lot of There was a lot of examination. There was a tremendous lot of public scrutiny, at least within the subculture, within these smaller groups, that went along with being converted and then seeking holiness. So the way that they interpret it, again, is this spiritual rebirth. There's a death of the old self. The Baptists very literally do immersion baptisms that show this, which marks them out as distinctive in many ways. But depending on which type of Baptist you were, that rite had greater or lesser importance in the conversion experience. There's some who believe that without that full immersion of baptism, that conversion is not real, and that's not a hard and fast line, but it certainly is certainly a theme within Baptist practice and Baptist theology. There are a sequence of clearly mapped out steps to get to conversion. They're played out in public. They're played out in front of the congregation. In the case of a regular church service, they're played out in front of a large gathering of people in the revival settings. There's a lot of emotion. The person who's seeking salvation is looking at the terror of eternal damnation. But they're also looking at redemption. So they're looking at the cost of continual sin, and then they're looking at the redeeming quality of Christ's atonement. So there's both terror and there's hope that's held out in these services, which leads to a tremendous amount of emotion. And this is a mark of revivalism are these emotional releases. Very dramatic singing, shouting, exhorting by individuals within the audience, not just the minister who's leading. Though that changes as we go deeper into the 19th century, as these groups become a little bit more regularized, as they become a dominant culture rather than an emerging culture. We kind of hinted around at that a little bit last time, that there are going to be some changes once these denominations establish themselves as insiders rather than outsiders. And by 1850, 1860, there's no doubt that the Baptists and the Methodists and the Presbyterians are the insiders. It leads to different forms of practice, different forms of revivalism, a less emotive form of revivalism as you move into the 1850s and the Third Great Awakening. It's not a static experience. It's not even a static experience from Cane Ridge in 1801 to the Finneyite revivals in the 1820s, 30s, and into the 1840s. The process of conversion starts with a state of what Finney and other revivalists would call concern about the state of one's soul. That was then followed by inquiry into what is best termed as, what can I do to be saved? The question is, what can I do to be saved? So there's concern, there's inquiry, there's this question, what can I do to be saved? Calvinist is not going to, 18th century Calvinist is not going to ask that question, at least in a public way. Though there are theologians who are, moving around the edges of that and perhaps implying that question. And certainly later there's challenges with this Arminian system. But the question is, what can I do to be saved? This leads to anxiety. What is it that I can do? How can I best appeal to God to obtain salvation and to become born again? There's a tremendous amount of fear. The revival meetings themselves are marked by outbursts of agonizing wails and shouts and moans and crying. The sounds from a revival meeting, I would love to be able to reproduce, because it's an auditory experience that is long past. But it would have been a fascinating sound to hear, as you have dozens and dozens of mourners on the anxious bench up front, who are considering the state of their soul, who are literally anxious about their about their future state, and the singing that goes along with it, the clapping and the shouting that goes with this, the extemporaneous preaching that's going on, the plain language of the sermons that's being preached. Just an absolutely, and then there's all kinds of things that are going on around the edges that we'll talk about in just a minute. But just the central act of taking these anxious individuals, putting them together, and then praying and preaching and exhorting among them, and leading these individuals to conversion. Because it's interesting, once they become converted, they become helpers in leading others to conversion. So there's a social pattern with this as well. Once the period of anxiety passes, there's a sense of conviction that you have been convicted of being a sinner, and that you realize that the only way to move forward, because you had been justly condemned of your sins, is to ask, and because you are judged to be guilty of your sins, you are judged to be liable to eternal damnation. Then you move to the release moment, where that conversion takes place, where there's a confession, where the charge of changing one's heart and changing one's actions as a part of this new community, where that takes place. And then again, the newly converted then becomes a helper to those who had been praying over, exhorting, etc. During the conversions process. So that's kind of a 20,000 foot view of the conversion experience, said, or what happens in the conversion experience, and it's a pattern that plays out over and over and over. There are manuals written about this by people like Finney, the new methods of conversion and promoting revival. So let's back up again another half a step and think about revival itself, because the process of conversion, the changes in theology, the process of conversion are all played out in this revival setting. And the revivals of the 19th century are distinctly different than the revivals of the 18th century. Though you would have seen some emotion in the 18th century, these new revivals are especially emotional. In the 18th century, the phenomenon that would have been being described by the word revival was when a church experienced, and this is, I'll read from an unexpected awakening of spiritual concern occasioned by a special and mysterious outpouring of God's saving grace. That's an 18th century view of what a revival was. So it's a congregational thing. You were with the people that you had gone to church with, and there would come a time when God through Christ would pour out blessing, and there would be an uptick, an enthusiasm or excitement about religious practice. These were surprising conversions. Again, very different than the 19th century, where these are planned events. Where revival is something that is planned ahead of time. That's not to say that they're not 18th century examples of services that look a whole lot like events like Cane Ridge and then later protracted meetings. The sacramental season that the Presbyterians practiced in some parts of the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, very, very similar to the revival meetings themselves. But in general, when you're looking at 18th century revival, it's a surprising number of conversions where enthusiasm for religious action and activity ticks upward. The revival in the 19th century becomes a central instrument for provoking conversions rather than waiting for an outpouring of grace from God. So the shift is pretty dramatic in the ways that this form of preaching, this new form of preaching, this new form of understanding conversion takes place. As Charles Gradison Finney put it, revival was something preachers and communicants did. It was a deliberately orchestrated event that deployed a variety of spiritual practices to provoke conversions, especially among the unconverted youth. And that would be people between 15 and 30, men and women. And this is something that's very, very important about these events. And this is something that's very, very important about the democratic religious institutions that are built up in the 19th century. These are institutions that are very heavily populated women. A majority of a typical congregation, between 55 and 65% of a typical congregation were women. And that holds true for revival services themselves, where a tremendous number of the participants are women. They exhort, they lead prayers, they speak out. They're not the formal appointed leaders of the congregations or the revival meeting itself, but they do participate. And this is something of a departure, especially in public worship, where women take a leading role. In the Methodist system, exhorting is very, very similar to preaching, and that was a role that many women, black and white, took up during the first half of the 19th century, and they gained respect in those roles. They were respected by the men who were leading the leading the services, leading the congregations. There are many examples of Methodist circuit riders praising the women who were taking these vocal roles or taking a part of these services themselves. So very, very important shift. And again, this gets at this democratic, popular form of religion, and it gets at this decentralized sense of authority. Black women, white women, young and old, could speak out in these services and could have influence over men and women. And in a lot of cases, we were talking about church discipline a few minutes ago. We were talking about the Methodist class system, where you had small groups that would work together. You would see women leading in those functions as well. So it's a really, really important transition that you're seeing. Women also led Sunday schools, very important teachers. And one of the questions that I have, and this becomes especially true in the South in the latter part of the antebellum era, women were organizing the church schools, what we call Sunday school today, and they were instructing the young men and young girls, young boys and girls, in the right religious duties. And when you think about what changes during the Civil War, when these young men go off and join the Army, and we think about their religious experience in the Army, is what does the absence of those women do to religion in the South? The women's voices that had been very, very important in the antebellum period disappear for 4 years, for the most part, in the camps and in the religious services. It's a very male-dominated arena. And so what does that do to the ways that these young men who are growing up and becoming converted Christians in the Army camps? Because this is a pattern that you see. There's not a whole lot of religious adherence early on, increasingly so as the war goes on, and more intensely in moments of crisis. But in those contexts, it's always a male chaplain who is providing the religious instruction, not only in the sermons in the formal settings, but also as advisors in private moments. So it's an interesting question to think about. Is what happens to the ways that these young men understand their religious duty, and those who can lead in the church without the voices of the women who had traditionally been a part of that religious education, and even as a part of meeting out church discipline, and in some cases, by even in the late antebellum period, continuing to exhort. So it's a question that some graduate student needs to grab a hold of. It's a really interesting problem to figure out. Women also are very active, become very active in the reform movements. That's where we're moving towards, right? We're going to get to the point at the end of this talk where we can talk about reform and reformism and prohibition and anti-slavery and women's rights and stopping the Sunday mail, all the things that come along with perfecting the world. Women are very vocal leaders in those adjuncts of the church, and they take from the church the moral energy and the moral perspective to push these reforms forward during the 19th century. So now this is particularly true of the North. In the southern states, this kind of reformism is exactly not what's going to be happening. And that is something that it was really foundationally established in the first round of revivals that you see in the southern states after the Revolution, and most particularly at Cane Ridge, and then associated meetings that come out of the famous Cane Ridge revival of 1801 in Kentucky. Because what happens is Southern theologians and Southern religious leaders, even before the pro-slavery theology becomes a really dominant force in Southern religion, they are focusing on individual conversion and not social reform. They are very specific in the ways that they look at and prioritize individual conversion and de-emphasize social reform movements. And so that's a part of this foundational moment. So, as I said earlier, we most specifically have two periods of revival that are distinctly different. And the first is these famous camp meetings. The most famous is at Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801, Central Kentucky. They used to be called frontier camp revivals or frontier camp meetings. They were religious exercises that went on on the edges of where American colonists had been moving in the late 18th and early 19th century, sparsely populated. At Cane Ridge, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of people traveling 60, 70, 80 miles to come to a special event. And it becomes, and you see similar kinds of meetings happening in Western Virginia, Western North Carolina, and what used to be called the frontier of Kentucky and Ohio. Those fracture zones between where Native peoples still held sovereignty and where Americans were beginning to push. In the latter part of the 18th and the first part of the 19th century. These were services that were led by Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists, and a lot of it was in response to what these religious leaders saw as a very disordered society, a society that drank too much, a society that had too much illicit sex, a society that raced horses too often and listened to fiddle music and danced and did all of these sorts of things that become the hallmark in the latter part of the antebellum period is dissipating activities, wasting one's time, not putting one's efforts to making the world a better place or to get into making conversions. So at Cane Ridge, you're going to see a lot of stuff beyond just the preaching services and the anxious bench and the shouting and the singing, because around the edges of these camp meetings in the early republic, you would have also seen whiskey salesmen selling rot gut on the edges of the camp, because these people have come from 70, 80 miles away, and they set up a tent Later, those become regularized, and the campgrounds become more organized. They have discipline. People get up at the sounding of a bugle. There's a lot of order that goes to them. But early on, there's a lot of disorder that goes on around the edges, particularly of these campgrounds, people having sex and drinking whiskey and playing fiddle music within hearing distance of the revival meeting itself is not uncommon. So they're big events, and they're social events, and they're not they're not the cleanly delineated kinds of revivals that you see later on. But they do a tremendous amount of work, these revivals, towards evangelicalizing the southern states and the western states, and establish the churches, particularly the Baptists and the Methodists, and then lagging behind a little bit the Presbyterians, the new churches like the Christian Connection that comes out of the Cane Ridge revival. I hesitate to use the word, but primitive forms of religion where hierarchical structures are stripped away even more thoroughly, where instrumental music is seen as not hewing to the literal words of Scripture and things of this nature. So you begin to see coming out of these revivals new forms and new organizations around which people can organize their religious life. This setting up of the emphasis of Southern evangelicals on individual conversion is really, really important. I would encourage you to take a look at the list of books that Rob's posted up now or will be posting later. In John Bowles's book, The Great Revival, and Dixon Bruce's book, They All Sing Hallelujah, both from the early 1970s, but both really powerfully influential and insightful studies of camp revival meetings, the forms of camp revival with the Dave Bruce, and then a little bit more broadly with John Bowles. But they really do a good job of showing, particularly Bowles, showing how this focus on individual conversion becomes the emphasis of the Southern evangelical churches. So take a look at those if you want to dig a little bit deeper into that distinctive divergence between Northern and Southern evangelicals in Bowles's book. So what's the next phase of protracted or of revivals? Well, as things become a little more settled, as you begin to see towns grow up, and we're going to focus here very specifically on upstate New York and the burned over district, because there's so much religious activity, so many revivals, so much religious innovation that even at the time in the mid 19th century, it's called the burned over district because the fires of revival have swept back and forth across this stretch of land. Well, where is this stretch of land? Well, it follows the Erie Canal and the towns that are built up along the Erie Canal. And in some ways, you can see these religious forces and these revivals. And Paul Johnson, back in 1976, made a really strong argument that the revivals were a way that factory owners and shop owners and mill owners and canal owners and operators could enforce discipline on their employees. That getting these people to settle down, to have frugal habits, to not drink too much or not drink at all, were really a part of a way of disciplining this newly emerging labor force in the United States. I think Johnson goes a little bit too far with that, but certainly there's a tremendous amount of evidence that business people do this through the 19th century and into the 20th century, where business people promote revivals and promote the activities of revival preachers. And Charles Grandison Finney is one of these guys. And he's invited to these towns along the Erie Canal to preach, and he preaches very successfully in the burned over district. And what he does, and what these new measures of revivalism, this new form of revivalism that Finney really promotes and that Finney writes about, and issues a manual on the new measures. how to do it. So how to manual for conducting a revival, or what became known as a protracted meeting, because it depended on where you stood by the 1820s and the 1830s, just as to how emotional and to how raucous these revival meetings were. And in some places, I studied Georgia and wrote about revivals, the 1828 revival in the Cotton Belt of Georgia, and the tone was very different than what you'd have seen in a Finneyite revival in New York in the same period. There'd be loud shouting and singing. And as one Baptist put it in Georgia, that one of the great revival ministers of the area moved the audience to the profoundest silence. And so you're seeing very different forms. You're seeing very different ways of expressing religion and expressing even revivalism, which, it kind of has this reputation as being this wild and loose kind of experience. But in some places, like the plantation belts of Georgia, in South Carolina for that matter, have very, very restrained performances of revival. You're still seeing a lot of conversions in the 1828 revivals in Georgia and South Carolina. You see, for the first time, a tremendous number of wealthy people coming into the church, becoming members of the churches. And this is something that some historians see. John Wigger sees it very particularly when he's studying Methodism. You start in this 1820s revivalism. In the New Measures revivals of Finney, and then these pro-slavery revivals in Georgia and South Carolina, you're seeing the leading lights of the society affiliating themselves with these congregations, and it leads to a pretty significant change in the leadership, and a significant, you end up with some of these Georgia churches with the governor of the state of Georgia serving as a deacon, and influential educators and others who become very public parts of these churches in Plantation Belt, Georgia. So maybe we can talk about that down the road a little bit, but let's get through with this one first and see what we can find. So let's get to Finney. Let's get to Finney for just a few minutes, because he's a fascinating character, and he brings in all kinds of innovations. He was well known for his ability to emotionally affect the individuals who are sitting on the anxious bench. These are people who are in that in between, that liminal phase between being convicted and having this sense of sinfulness and conversion. And he would bring them to the front of the congregation. This is not something he invented, but it's something he certainly perfected. And Finney was known to be a very effective speaker. He was extemporaneous in his preaching. Many observations of Finney fixing his stare upon a person and holding an audience in his gaze. He had piercing blue eyes, dark hair, a very dramatic figure. Had been a lawyer. Or was training to be a lawyer when he is himself converted in the early 1820s, and then goes on to be. And a lot of people say that listening to his sermon was more like listening to a legal argument in a courtroom than a traditional sermon. So even the form of the organization and the thrust of the preaching that Finney was delivering was very distinctive and very not like something George Whitefield would have done in the 1840s and the 1850s, or 1740s and 1750s. There's a great passage from one of Finney's 1831 sermons that I think kind of just sums up his approach to revivalism and to conversion and to agency. Because again, this is a story, I think, of a turning in the way that people are seeing themselves as actors in the world. They're not passive receivers; they are now active agents of change. And this sermon. There's a sermon that Finney gave at the Park Street Church in Boston in October of 1831, and it uses an analogy, and it's a fascinating one. And this is a quote from the sermon. This is how he starts the sermon. A man in a daydream drifts towards the precipice of Niagara Falls, unaware of the danger. On the opposite side, someone watches. Just as the man is about to plunge, the observer cries out, "Stop!" The shout awakened the man. And at the critical moment, he is saved. A crowd gathers. "That man saved my life." The crowd responds, "But how?" "Oh, he called to me at the very moment I was stepping off, and that word 'stop' snatched me from destruction. Oh, if I had not turned in that instant, I should have been dashed to pieces. Oh, it was the mercy of God that kept me from a horrible death." So what's Finney saying here? What is Finney saying here? He's establishing, I think, three really important points about the efficacy of active means of preachers preaching for conversion, not preaching to edify, not preaching to inform, not preaching to elucidate a theological perspective or a biblical text. The activity of a preacher is to save. So, what are the active means? What does he establish here? First, that sinners must act immediately in response to the voice of the preacher who shouts the word of God. 2, sinners must choose salvation or be dashed to pieces at the bottom of Niagara Falls or to be cast into hell. Sounds kind of like the sinner in the hand of an angry God, the loathsome spider dangling. So there are definitely echoes of Whitefield in some of this preaching that you're seeing, and echoes. These men were certainly intimately familiar with the preaching of those 18th century revivalists. In any case, the last part of this notion of active means is that conversion occurs because the preacher is effective. Because the preacher is effective. Now this sounds like a lawyer's brief, right? That the lawyer is able to make a compelling and powerful argument, speak at the right time, use the right words to achieve a certain end. And Finney practices his entire career, focuses his whole career on achieving that kind of relationship. Again, he's very popular in upstate New York, not so much in the South. Because a lot of the people that he ends up preaching with, to and for and around, become leaders of these social reform movements. There's also a lot of innovation that comes out of the revival meetings that Finney leads in the Burned Over district, and we'll run through a few of these right now, and then we can come back to them when we talk about reform movements next time. But there's a tremendous amount of religious innovation in that Burned Over district. You got at one extreme, you've got the celibate Shakers, a small group a subgroup of Quakers, Quietists. They lived celibate lives in dormitories. Very rarely were men and women allowed to socialize together. At the other end of this is the perfectionist Oneida community, where John Humphrey Noyes establishes a community where quote unquote free love was established. That people who had come to the Oneida community had reached a certain stage of perfection in a common marriage and sexual experimentation or sexual enjoyment amongst everyone was the norm, and it was all directed by a committee of elders. There's Jemima Wilkinson, who led a group of what historians describe as semi-celibate followers who believed that Wilkinson was the purported reincarnation of Christ in female form. This is in the 1820s. Charles Miller, maybe some of you have heard of the Millerite movement in the early 1840s. Miller was an Adventist. He believed that he could read the Bible in a certain way and know exactly when Christ was going to return. He predicted that was going to happen in October of 1843. It didn't. He was somewhat discredited there, but there continued to be Adventists who followed Miller and others who were actively looking for the return of Christ in the very, very near future. So Mormonism comes out of this area. It's probably the most innovative takes on Christianity comes from the semi-literate Joseph Smith, who argues that the angel Moroni encouraged him to unearth golden tablets that were buried in a hill outside of Palmyra, New York. And then he was able to decipher, and it took him about 2 years to decipher, quote, the reformed Egyptian alphabet to create a new religion. Now, that was a little bit too far for a lot of people in upstate New York. As you know, the Mormons end up in Illinois. There's, Smith is murdered. There's tremendous violence directed towards the Mormons. They're pushed out of Illinois, and then they end up in what's now Utah. An incredibly successful denomination that comes out of the religious excitement and enthusiasm of the burned over district in the 1840s. The spiritualist movement it's a little bit beyond the traditional Christianity, but becomes incredibly popular after the Civil War, especially as people are trying to understand the fate of loved ones who were killed in the war. But this is the period during which spiritualism in Western New York develops. Doesn't really become a big thing until the Civil War, but it comes out of this foment of religious idealism. So you've got, I guess if you really wanted to take it down to the brass tacks, is that there's a tremendous lot of innovation going on here, that perfectionist inspired groups, and I think that all of these groups could be well defined as perfectionist. They're looking to create a better world. They're looking to, and whether that be through conversions of individuals, whether that be through social reform, through personal holiness or through public holiness, that all of these groups have some form of perfectionism, some sort of social vision or individual vision that's going to lead to something brand new. So that's where we're going to stop for today. That I think sets up pretty well the talk I want to do on reform movements next time, because a lot of what's happening and what goes on in the 1840s, 50s, and up to 1860, the beginning of the war, draws its energy from this form of religious faith, this form of conversion, this form of revival religion, and most specifically out of this perfectionist notion that develops through the activities of these revivalists and others. So that's what we got for today. Take a look at the book list that Rob has posted up for you. If you're not a member already, go over our website and become a member. It's an important part of how we continue doing what we do, and allows us to continue to do these kinds of programs. So go on over to the Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center website, sign up to be a member. All kinds of neat stuff comes along with it. Pete and I do a happy hour once a month. You get special content, access to special content, things that Pete and I write, things that we share with members only. So that's it for today. Next time I'm with you, I'm going to be talking about reformism. So I hope you took notes today, and you can remember all of this, all the lead up to these social movements of the late 19th century or the middle 19th century. Good gracious! All right, y'all take care, and I will see you soon.